Depth of field. What is it and what can it do for your photos or video? You may not have heard of the term, but you certainly recognize its effects. Right now, the background behind me is a blur of green. But with the change of a few settings, you can clearly see the leaves behind me. Controlling that aspect of a photo is what's known as controlling your depth of field. What controls depth of field? Let's start with aperture. When someone spends hundreds or thousands of dollars on a lens, generally they're spending that much money for a lens with a wide aperture or a low f number. That means that the lens lets in a lot of light. In addition to letting in a lot of light, it's also easier to blur the background when the lens has a lower f-stop. So at f1.8, as you can see here, the depth of field is very shallow. At f8, there's even more depth of field, and you can see that in both front and the back. You can normally control the f-stop through a dial on the camera or on the lens. None of this has anything to do with autofocus. You're going to want to focus on the subject of your photo. But when you do change your aperture, you're going to want to make sure that you adjust your other settings accordingly. For video, you'll probably want to adjust your ISO so that your shutter speed doesn't change and you change the look of the video. But for photos, you can adjust your shutter speed or you can adjust your ISO to compensate for the change in aperture. Zoom and where you're standing can also affect your depth of field. A 70 to 200 millimeter lens will be able to blur out the background more at 200 millimeters than it will at 70 millimeters given the same settings, in this case f5.6. Wide-angle lenses have a particularly difficult time blurring out the background, but in some circumstances, depending on where you're standing, it could work. How far you are away from the background can also affect your depth of field. Even with a wide-angle lens, if you're far enough away with the right settings, you can separate the background from your subject with shallow depth of field. If you place your subject on the same plane of focus as your background, you won't be able to separate them with shallow depth of field. And you'll also make them very uncomfortable by placing them in a tree. Finally, the last part that is somewhat out of your control is sensor size. An iPhone sensor is smaller than a DSLR's sensor. Smaller sensors have difficulty creating shallow depth of field, though some cameras on phones like an iPhone can do portrait mode, which simulates shallow depth of field. So to sum it all up, some of the things that you can do to control your background blur are adjust your aperture, adjust your focal length, adjust your subject to background distance, and adjust your camera to subject distance.